Everyone, and welcome to CS121, lecture number 6. Today we're going to be talking about vectors. Before we talk about vectors, I want to discuss this idea of a data structure. Data structures in computer science are ways that we can organize and store our data. And a vector is going to be the first data structure that we're going to be learning about in this class. And in the next lecture, you're going to be learning about another data structure called a map. In classes after CS121, like in CS131, you're going to be exposed to more complex data structures, and that will allow you to work with different kinds of data more efficiently. CS interviews also focus very heavily on knowing what kind of data structures that you want to use to solve a problem. And in the real world, we use data structures quite often to decide how to store data because there's just so much data out there. So at YouTube, for my job, we use data structures to store things like videos or comments or user information for their accounts. But for today, let's just talk about vectors. When would we want to use a vector? So let's just imagine that we wanted to list out all of our favorite types of fruit. What we could do with what we know now is create a variable to hold a string which represents each of our favorite types of fruit. So I could define a variable called fruit1 and assign it a string value called pineapple. And then I could define the next favorite fruit on my list and put it in another variable, fruit2. And I could keep going on like this and define a new variable every time I want to add a fruit to my list. But if you can't already tell, this can get kind of tedious because every time I want to add a fruit to my list of favorite fruit, I would have to make a new string variable. And the more fruit that we have in our list, the more easy it is to mess up, or it gets more difficult to keep track of. And also, if we have all these different types of variables to store all of our favorite fruit, we can't answer some basic questions about this list of fruit. For example, I can't immediately tell how many fruit that I have in total in my list. I can't sort these fruit alphabetically, so I can't tell which one would come first alphabetically, etc., etc. So the root cause of this problem is essentially just the fact that we're storing all of our fruit in separate variables. So what we can do is instead use a single variable, and we can leverage the vector. So a vector is a data structure, and it's specifically designed to store a sequence of items. In other words, it's a container that holds a list of elements of a given type. So if we want to construct a vector, let's just zoom in on this idea that vectors are a container. And we know that containers, they must store something. So we need to decide when we're constructing a vector what data type is stored within that vector whenever we construct one. So one of the ways in C++ that we can construct a vector is using its default constructor. And so you're familiar already with default constructors since we've seen it in classes and instantiating objects. So in this case, you can tell that we're using the default constructor because we're defining a new variable, but we're not following it by the parentheses. We're not passing any parameters in. So we're constructing this vector with the default constructor. This syntax is actually quite similar to how we've declared variables like strings or ints in the past, but you'll notice something new about where we specify the data type. Now we have some arrow brackets, and within these arrow brackets, we specify the data type of the elements that are stored within this vector. So vectors, they're a container, and we need to tell the compiler that there's going to be one specific type that's going to be stored within this container. So what this statement tells us is that we're defining a vector whose variable name is student IDs, and that vector is going to hold ints. So how can we apply this to the problem that we saw in the last slide? If we wanted to create our list of fruits, instead of making new variables for every type of fruit in our list, we can just leverage the vector now. So what we can do is define a vector which holds strings, and we'll do that by putting a string within our arrow brackets to tell the compiler that this vector holds elements of the given type, which in this case is strings. And we're going to define this vector to be called fruits. The variable name for this vector will be fruits.